Our first reading is from Psalm 145, verses 13 through 19. Your reign is an everlasting reign, O Lord. Your dominion endures throughout all ages. You are faithful in all your words and merciful in all your deeds. The Lord upholds all those who fall and lifts up those who are bowed down. The eyes of all wait upon you, O Lord, and you give them their food in due season. You open wide your hand and satisfy the needs of every living creature. O Lord, you are righteous in all your ways and loving in all your works. You are near to all who call upon you faithfully. You fulfill the desire of those who fear you. You hear their cry and help them. Here ends the first reading.
Back in September, we started with our narrative lectionary series, beginning in the book of Genesis, and we'll make our way through until May to the book of Revelation. So we've been through the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, where the people of Israel have been down in Egypt and now have been freed and are in the Promised Land. We're going to be reading from the book of 2 Kings this morning, and 1st and 2nd Kings together are really one book. They cover about 400 years of history. Last week we heard in 1 Kings 5 the story of King Solomon beginning the construction and consecration of the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem. This morning we're moving ahead a number of decades, and we're not going to focus on a king, but instead on a prophet, on the prophet Elisha. Now, most of us are probably more familiar with the prophet Elijah. Their names are pretty similar. But Elijah was the one who was there at the Transfiguration with Jesus, along with Moses. He was one of the most important characters in all of the Old Testament. He was known for his very dramatic and public acts during a difficult time for the people of Israel. He emphasized God's law and God's judgment. Well, this morning we're going to hear about Elisha, and Elisha was both his disciple and his protege. He's the one who, after Elijah was taken up to heaven in the whirlwind, Elisha takes up his mantle as the new leader, as the new head of a school of prophets in the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, when we join the story this morning in 2 Kings 4, this is where Elisha is performing a number of miracles. And they all have to do with very common and everyday experiences of the people. So we're going to hear the last couple of special miracles that he performs at the end of the chapter, as I'll be reading from verses 38 through 44. So I invite us to listen again for God's word. Elisha returned to his hometown, to Gilgal, where there was a famine in the land. A group of prophets was sitting down before him. He said to his servant, "Put on the big pot and cook some stew for the prophets." So one of them went out to the field to gather some plants for the stew. There he found a wild vine, and he gathered the wild gourds that were growing on it, filled up his garment to carry them back in. Then he cut them up and he put them in a pot of stew. But no one knew what the gourds were. Now the stew was served to the prophets, and as they began to eat it, they cried out and they said, "O man of God, there is death in that pot." And they could not eat it. So Elijah said, "Bring me some flour." And he took the flour and he threw it into the pot, and he said, "Serve it to the people, and so they can eat." At that point, there was nothing harmful left in the pot of stew, and all of the men, the prophets, ate. Later, a man came from Baal Shalisha. He was bringing to the man of God, to Elisha, some bread from the first fruits of the harvest. He brought 20 loaves of barley bread and also fresh grain in his bag. Elisha said, "Give these to the people so that they may eat." But his servant said, "How can we possibly serve 100 men with this small portion?" Elisha replied, "Give it to the people so that they can eat. Hear what the Lord says. Eat, and there will be leftovers." And so the servant gave the food to them. And indeed, they all ate, and there was food left over, in agreement with the Lord's word. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I mentioned that last week in 1 Kings, we heard that story of King Solomon, who was building this magnificent temple in Jerusalem. This was an enormous and expensive, years-long building project that he had undertaken. And the temple, indeed, as we mentioned last week, came to symbolize the Hebrew people. It became their center of worship, the center of their economic and commerce life, and in some ways the center of their whole community. The people were closely identified with this new building. But the temple was in some ways bigger than life. It was more than just a building, it was a symbolic importance to the people throughout the centuries. Well, it seems to me that this week the narrative lectionary is going to the other extreme. Instead of a magnificent temple, we get a pot of stew, some bread, and a bag of grain. And I have to say, my honest first reaction was to be let down a little bit. Is that it? Is that all we have to work with this week? So we've gone from the Holy of Holies, where God's Spirit is present in the Ark of the Covenant, to a simple meal for a group of prophets. But I do think there is some richness here in these stories this morning, that underneath and behind these simple miracle stories, we have a vision of God's desire for provision and for protection for the people. And so I want us to look a little deeper into these simple stories this morning. And to do that, I'm going to start with a different story, a different tale that I heard recently. And it comes from a pastor who is beginning a new call at a rural community church. And she shares this. She said, "It was my first Sunday as the new pastor of this church. I opened up the worship bulletin that morning to the announcements, and these words jumped off the page. And indeed, that was their intention. Written in the back of the bulletin in bold capital letters, followed by 3 exclamation points, the fellowship team made the following announcement: "Urgent! We are out of coffee creamer. Bring some this week or we will go without." There was no please, there was no thank you during this. The message didn't say, "If you happen to be at the grocery store, would you mind picking up some coffee creamer and bringing it by?" No, instead, it was filled with urgency, with anxiety, and with fear. The message screamed, "There's not enough. And if somehow we don't respond, we are going to be facing a Sunday without coffee creamer." And what could be worse? It was anxiety that came out very clearly in that announcement. Now, she goes on to write that in this bulletin announcement, it had in some ways its foundation, its background in our modern American culture that often fosters what she called a mindset or an attitude of scarcity. This is a story that says there is never enough. There's never enough money or resources. There's never enough time or attention. there's never enough love. And in fact, there's not even enough coffee creamer to go around. Now, she writes this, she said, "This, I found, was a very generous church, and the people truly wanted to serve God. And they do so in so many different ways. But even so, this mindset, this attitude of scarcity is ever present in our lives together." Now, we may know that this mindset of scarcity has some very deep and wandering and deep effects in our lives together and in our communities. Because scarcity means that someone is going to be left out. And I think that fear often drives us to make sure that we are not the ones who are left behind or left out. And so the logical response to the call of there is not enough is the statement that more is better. But more is better happens to stimulate fear and greed. It speeds up that disparity between those with and those without, between the rich and the poor. And it's done so for 2 millennia. More is better is, of course, a never-ending pursuit, one that we never win in the end. Some of you may know the saying of John D. Rockefeller back when he was the wealthiest man in the nation. And a journalist asked him, "How much money is enough to make you happy?" And his famous reply was, "Just a little bit more." And I think in some ways, whether we recognize it or not, we all embody that attitude, just a little bit more. But there's another result from this mindset of scarcity in which we live. And that is we say, well, that's just the way it is. That's how the world works. And so we find a way to justify or to excuse greed and intolerance in inaction. We see injustices all around us and we feel powerless to make any real change in our culture. So scarcity fosters an attitude that says, I can't do anything about it. It is what it is, and I'm just going to make the best for myself and my family. And so systems that perpetuate scarcity do so that are deeply embedded in our world and in our culture. And somehow we feel like we simply cannot change it. It's too much to take on. A few years ago, some researchers at UC San Diego published the findings of a study that they called the sharing game. In this experiment, they took random participants and they invited them to choose one of 2 options. In the first option, the participant would receive $7 in cash. No questions asked, they could take it with them. But if they did that, an unknown person would receive $9. They were given a second option. They could receive $3 in cash, $5 in cash, no questions asked. But in that option, this unknown person would receive only $3. And guess what the results were? An overwhelming majority of the participants chose option number 2. Even though they would be receiving less money they would have otherwise, they chose to have more than someone else was getting, simply because they did not want their neighbor to have more than they did. They would accept less for themselves in return for this outcome. Now, in some ways, we're maybe not surprised by that outcome. After all, we know about the crisis that's happening right now with the suspension of SNAP, the food stamps benefits, and the court actions that are trying to restore those payments. It's a powerful reminder that that mindset of scarcity can be devastating, especially to the most vulnerable among us. That somehow we have a large portion of our nation saying there are millions of children and seniors and veterans and disabled folks who somehow do not deserve the most basic needs. while the most wealthy among us get even more. Somehow we have seen that as acceptable. So with that as background, let's turn to our second Kings stories this morning. Because scarcity was indeed a reality of that time. I don't know if you noticed, but at the first line it said, when Elisha returned to Gilgal, there was a famine in the land, most likely caused by a multi-year drought. And so in such a setting of scarcity and famine, we might expect the usual response, that people are fearful, that they're hoarding their food, that they're greedy and holding on to as much as they possibly can. But notice Elisha has a very different story to tell in these two miracle stories. He's telling the story of an abundant creator who gives more than enough, who gives life and purpose and provisions beyond what we could possibly expect. And so Elisha is retelling the story of that God that the Israelites met out in the wilderness. Remember, we told this story just about a month ago. As they were wandering away, not knowing where they were going next, escaping from Egypt, they were out of food. And of course, the people begin to complain. Where are we going to get our food? And that's when the manna is provided in the wilderness. And do you remember that story? How much did they have? Enough for one day. And in fact, you couldn't trade it for more. You couldn't hold on to it for more than a day, otherwise it would rot. And you couldn't store it up for later. There wasn't too much, there wasn't too little, there was enough for everyone for that day. And everyone ate and made it to the promised land. And so in our story this morning, we can imagine Elijah recalling that story as the pot of stew for the hungry prophet suddenly turns rancid. The response is not panic, but rather trusting in this man of God who turns that rancid stew into a life-giving meal by putting flour in it, and somehow it becomes good to eat. And then when the man comes with the barley loaves and with the bag of grain, he's bringing it as an offering to Elisha. And as the head prophet, it was expected that he would hold on to that. He had every right. He was entitled to that food and to that grain. But instead, he trusts the God of abundance, and he says, give it to the people. Give it away so that they may eat. And in the hands of Yahweh, this small offering is more than enough to feed 100 men with food left over. In our Wednesday Bible study this week, as we read this story, it was clear, as a number of folks mentioned, that this story is reminiscent of one we hear later in the Bible, right? The story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which is one of the few stories that is actually in all four of the Gospels. In fact, two of the Gospel writers tell it twice, as a 4,000 of the 5,000. It's told 6 different times in the Gospels. And do you remember that story where it begins with the disciples in a scarcity mindset? It's getting late in the day, and there's a huge crowd out in the wilderness with Jesus. And they say, you know what? It's getting late. Let's send the people back to the town so they can eat, and we can go and get our rest for the day. And Jesus turns to them. You remember what he said? You give them something to eat. And they look around and look at each other and like, well, we don't have money in the budget. There's not resources to do this. There's not a grocery store nearby. How are we possibly going to feed these people? And again, they want to send them away. But Jesus, of course, has a different mindset. He was remembering that core story of God's creation, and he sees abundance and grace in the midst of desperate need. And so he challenges the disciples again, you give them something to eat. And what do? They find a child who comes up and has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Of course, that's not nearly enough to feed everybody, But Jesus takes the bread, you remember that? And he breaks the bread in giving thanks, and they hand it out. And of course, there is more than enough, with 12 loaves left over, just like the story we heard today. Scarcity and abundance are two issues we deal with on a daily basis. And it's very easy to get into that mindset that we don't have enough. But again and again through the history of the church, we are reminded that we have a God who is abundant and gives more than we need. Way back in the 3rd century, there was a church father by the name of St. Basil the Great. And he put this issue of scarcity and abundance a little bit more bluntly than Jesus did. Listen to what he wrote. He said, "The bread that you hold back belongs to the hungry. The coat that you guard in your locked storage chest belongs to the naked. The footwear moldering in your closet belongs to those without shoes. The silver you keep hidden belongs to the one in need. Thus, however many of those for whom could be provided for, so many of those do you wrong." That is a very radical call to scarcity and abundance and responding appropriately. And this challenge, of course, is still with us today in our own time. Here's how one contemporary writer put it. He said, "In a culture of scarcity and greed, generosity becomes an act of resistance. Sharing reorders our hearts. It dethrones money and enthrones love in our lives. And so when we share our resources equitably, we declare a theology of abundance. There is enough. God provides. And we are not enemies with the other, but we are neighbors. And so when we break the bread and we share it, there is enough for all. But when we hoard it, just like the manna, it rots and decays. And so our call cannot be ignored. We must hold leaders accountable with both truth and compassion. We must support policies that reflect love of neighbor and not love of wealth. We must practice small and consistent acts of generosity because they bear witness to God's generosity and abundance. And as Jesus said, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Friends, we live in a nation that worships wealth all too often. And it means that we are always willing to sacrifice the poor and those on the margins. And I think that's happening right now in our midst. But we as followers of Christ are called to a different path, an abundant path. We are called to live with open hearts and open hands and to give all that we have abundantly to those in need. And so, friends, as we gather again this morning around this table of abundance, we proclaim that the church must not mirror the attitude of scarcity that we see in our culture. Instead, we must act out the abundance of God's kingdom. Because the bread keeps multiplying when it is broken and when it is shared. And that is the good news that we must share with the world. And so, friends, to God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.